A renewed focus on freedom. The United States is turning its attention to a forgotten crisis. High in the Himalayas, the Tibetan people are struggling for their freedom. China has occupied Tibet for decades. The U.S. is increasing its diplomatic pressure on China over Tibet. This is a major development. It signals a renewed commitment to human rights. The U.S. is employing a multi-pronged approach. The goal is clear: to shine a light on China's oppression of Tibet. The U.S. wants to hold China accountable for its actions. This is a complex issue with a long history, but one thing is certain: the U.S. is now firmly focused on Tibet. The Tibetan people have suffered under Chinese rule. Their culture has been suppressed. Their religion has been attacked. Their basic human rights have been violated. The U.S. is sending a message to China. The message is clear. The world is watching. The oppression of the Tibetan people must end. This is not just about Tibet. It is about standing up for freedom and democracy everywhere. It is about defending the rights of all people to live in peace and dignity. The U.S. is taking a stand for what is right. The world is watching to see if other nations will follow. At the heart of the issue lies a fundamental disagreement. The U.S. does not recognize Tibet as part of China. This stance is rooted in history. Tibet has a long history of independence. China claims Tibet has always been a part of its territory. This claim is disputed by Tibetans and many international experts. The U.S. believes that Tibetans have the right to self-determination. This means that they should be able to decide their own future. The U.S. is calling for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. This resolution must respect the rights and aspirations of the Tibetan people. China, however, sees the U.S. involvement as interference in its internal affairs. It considers Tibet an inseparable part of its territory. This difference in viewpoints has been a major stumbling block in U.S.-China relations. The U.S. continues to push for dialogue between China and the Tibetan leadership. It believes that only through dialogue can a lasting solution be found. The U.S. also encourages China to respect the human rights of all Tibetans. The Dalai Lama is the spiritual leader of Tibet. He is a powerful symbol of peace and non-violence. He has lived in exile in India since 1959. This followed a failed Tibetan uprising against Chinese rule. Despite living in exile, he remains a beacon of hope for Tibetans. The U.S. has long been a supporter of the Dalai Lama. It recognizes him as a respected religious leader. It acknowledges his commitment to non-violence. The U.S. has provided a platform for the Dalai Lama to voice his concerns. This has angered China, which views the Dalai Lama as a dangerous separatist. The Dalai Lama advocates for a peaceful solution for Tibet. He seeks autonomy for Tibet within China. This means Tibetans would govern their own affairs. China, however, rejects any talk of autonomy. The Dalai Lama's message of peace and compassion resonates with many Americans. His courage in the face of oppression is an inspiration. The U.S. continues to support his efforts to find a peaceful resolution for Tibet. In a powerful display of support, U.S. delegations have met with the Dalai Lama. These meetings are highly symbolic. They underscore the U.S.'s commitment to the Tibetan cause. They also serve as a direct challenge to China. These meetings infuriate China. China views them as interference in its internal affairs. It sees them as legitimizing the Dalai Lama's separatist agenda. Despite Chinese pressure, the U.S. has refused to back down. The message is clear: the U.S. will not be bullied into silence. These meetings are not just symbolic gestures. They provide an opportunity for U.S. officials to hear directly from the Dalai Lama. They discuss the situation in Tibet. They explore ways to improve the lives of the Tibetan people. These meetings send a strong message of support to Tibetans inside Tibet. They show them that they are not forgotten. They give them hope that their struggle is recognized on the world stage. Section 5. Shining a light on oppression cultural strategies. The United States uses culture to raise awareness about Tibet. Movies, documentaries, and books highlight the Tibetan struggle. These works reach a global audience. They educate people about the plight of the Tibetans. Hollywood brings the Tibetan story to the big screen. Films like 7 Years in Tibet and Kundun captivate audiences. They tell the story of Tibet's occupation and the Dalai Lama's life, sparking conversations about Tibet and China's human rights record. Documentaries provide a raw look at Tibet. Films like Leaving Fear Behind expose harsh realities, documenting the courage of Tibetan activists. These works are powerful tools for raising awareness. They challenge people to think critically about Tibet, inspiring people to take action, giving a voice to the voiceless. Section 6. A culture crushed. The plight of Tibetans. The Tibetan people have endured decades of suffering under Chinese rule. Their culture and religion have been systematically suppressed. They have been denied basic human rights. The United States is drawing attention to these abuses. It is calling for an end to the oppression. Tibetans have faced restrictions on their religious practices. Monasteries have been destroyed or converted for other uses. Monks and nuns have been imprisoned or forced to undergo patriotic education. The Chinese government aims to control the narrative of Tibetan Buddhism. The Tibetan language has also been marginalized. Chinese is increasingly being used in schools and government offices. This policy threatens the survival of the Tibetan language and culture. It is seen as an attempt to erase Tibetan identity. Tibetans have also experienced economic marginalization. They are often excluded from economic opportunities. They are denied access to education and healthcare. This has led to widespread poverty and despair. Section 7. Standing Up for Tibet, the Tibetan Policy and Support Act. The United States Congress passed the Tibetan Policy and Support Act, TPSA, in 2020. This landmark legislation strengthens U.S. support for Tibet. It sends a strong message to China that its actions in Tibet have consequences. The TPSA outlines a comprehensive policy approach to Tibet. It reaffirms the United States' commitment to the Tibetan people's right to self-determination. It calls for the protection of Tibetan culture, religion, and language. It also addresses the issue of the Tibetan Buddhist succession. The act states that the Dalai Lama's succession should be determined by Tibetans, not by China. This provision directly challenges China's interference in Tibetan religious affairs. It affirms the United States' support for Tibetan religious freedom. The TPSA also authorizes funding for various programs to benefit Tibetans. These include support for democracy promotion, human rights monitoring, and cultural preservation. Section 8. China's response, outrage and condemnation. China has reacted with fury to the U.S.'s increased focus on Tibet. It has condemned U.S. actions as interference in its internal affairs. It has accused the U.S. of trying to undermine its sovereignty. China maintains that Tibet is an integral part of its territory. It claims that its rule has brought stability and prosperity to the region. It denies any human rights abuses in Tibet. It accuses the U.S. of hypocrisy and double standards. China has responded to U.S. actions with a mix of diplomatic protests and economic retaliation. It has summoned U.S. diplomats to lodge formal complaints. It has threatened to impose sanctions on U.S. officials and entities involved in Tibet-related issues. China's aggressive response highlights the sensitivity of the Tibet issue. It demonstrates the challenges the U.S. faces in its efforts to promote human rights and democracy in China. Section 9. The Dalai Lama's Vision, a Future of Peace. Despite the challenges, the Dalai Lama remains committed to a peaceful resolution. He has consistently advocated for dialogue and reconciliation. He believes that violence is never the answer. His vision is for Tibet to have genuine autonomy within China. The Dalai Lama's vision is based on the middle way approach. This approach seeks to find a compromise between Tibetan aspirations for self-rule and China's insistence on maintaining territorial integrity. It envisions a future where Tibetans can preserve their culture and identity while living in peace with China. The Dalai Lama's message of peace and compassion resonates with people around the world. He has inspired millions with his unwavering commitment to nonviolence. He remains a powerful symbol of hope for a better future for Tibet. The U.S. supports the Dalai Lama's vision for a peaceful resolution. It believes that dialogue is the only way to achieve a lasting solution that respects the rights and aspirations of both the Tibetan and Chinese people. Section 10. A global movement for Tibet. The struggle for Tibet is not just a local issue. It has evolved into a global movement. People around the world are raising their voices in support of Tibet. They are demanding an end to China's oppression. They are calling for a free and democratic Tibet. Tibetan activists have played a crucial role in raising awareness. They have organized protests and campaigns to highlight the plight of Tibetans. They have lobbied governments and international organizations to take action. Their efforts have brought the Tibet issue to the forefront of global attention. International organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have documented human rights abuses in Tibet. They have called on China to respect the rights of Tibetans. Their reports have provided valuable evidence of China's crackdown on dissent and religious freedom in Tibet. The global movement for Tibet has gained momentum in recent years. This is due in part to the increasing awareness of China's human rights record. It is also a testament to the courage and resilience of the Tibetan people. Section 11. The importance of U.S. leadership. The U.S. has a crucial role to play in supporting the Tibetan people. As a global leader, it has a moral obligation to speak out against injustice and oppression. It has a responsibility to promote human rights and democracy around the world. The U.S.'s renewed focus on Tibet sends a clear message to China. It shows that the world is watching and that there will be consequences for its actions. It also sends a message of hope to the Tibetan people. It shows them that they are not forgotten, and that they have allies in their struggle for freedom. The U.S. must continue to use its diplomatic, economic, and cultural influence to pressure China to change its policies in Tibet. It must work with its allies to build international support for the Tibetan cause. It must stand